Tidal horns go off at 4:30 every morning on Arvel's Reach. 3 long blasts, 1 short, and then the surge comes. 6 meters of black salt water boiling up through the cliff fissures and hammering the lower dock until the struts shudder and the tie lines sing. I'd slept through it for 11 years. The sound was just weather to me. The way the groaning of the cradle winches and the grind of the anchor chain drums were weather. The dock was my dock. The noise was my noise. I didn't hear it anymore. That morning I heard every second of it. I should say something about Arvel's Reach, because most people who've never been to a contested border moon don't understand what it means to be the keeper of the only repair dock inside 60,000 kilometers of open space. It means you are essential. It means the Keth freight lines use your cradle winches and the Serev compact cargo. Haulers use your fuel cells, and the independent traders, who don't care about either faction, use your drive bays and your tool stores and your cold water supply, and none of them have anywhere else to go. It means that in 11 years of border tension and 4 years of what the arbitration services were carefully calling an active occupation, nobody had moved on my dock, because moving on my dock would have meant losing the only maintained repair facility on this face of the moon, and nobody wanted to lose that badly enough to actually do it. Then, the Serev Compact's 3rd Reach Battalion decided that a Keth command courier running through Arvel's airspace on a storm night was worth suing regardless of collateral inconvenience, and the dropship went into the cliff-face tidal zone, and Sergeant Draven arrived the next morning and decided to test whether I was as essential as I thought I was. Turns out I was. Turns out there were other things on that dock that morning that were considerably more essential than me. But Draven didn't know that yet, and neither did I. I heard it because I was chained to the wall of my own repair shed, wrists above my head, ankles hobbled with a length of Serev cable, and the chain bracket was 6 centimeters above where I could reach it even on my toes. Sergeant Draven had been precise about that. He was precise about most things, in the way that men with no imagination are precise. They follow the form exactly because they've never had a reason to deviate. The wall bracket had been there since my husband Tomas had sunk the bolts, 14 years ago, hanging the heavy anchor chains while he worked the links. It was solid work, good iron. I'd never looked at it as anything other than a place to hang chain. I had been looking at it for 6 hours when the child found me. She came through the lower access panel, the one that opened onto the tide shelf below the dock floor. I had forgotten that panel existed. It was 14 centimeters of clearance, painted shut for 3 winters running because no one had needed it, and I had last opened it to retrieve a dropped ratchet head this spring before my husband died. It was not a door. It was not, by any reasonable definition, a way in, and yet there she was, pushing up through it like something the sea had decided to return, streaming salt water from every edge of her, and she stopped when she saw me. I saw her too, Keth, unmistakably. The amber gold of her skin was darker than any Serev colonist, and her eyes, when she fixed them on me in the half-dark of the shed, enormous, pale silver, the color of new steel, with irises that didn't reduce in the dim light but stayed wide and still in watching. She had the brow crests of a young one, the paired ridges of horn nub that the Keth adults let grow long and filed to points. Hers were still small, still soft-looking, like something not yet finished. She was wrapped from shoulder to ankle in travel cloth, the muted gray-green that Keth couriers use in the tidal zones. She would have been nearly invisible in the cliff fissures, nearly invisible on the sea shelf, and she had been floating, or crawling or swimming, in the lower channels, for God knows how long, because her wrappings were soaked through and heavy, and she moved with the careful precision of something very cold and very tired. She looked at me. She looked at the chain. She looked at the bracket, and then she sat down on the floor of my shed, pulled her knees to her chest, and looked at me again. I said, "I won't hurt you." She said nothing. The Keth children don't speak to strangers easily. I'd had maybe 8 of them pass through the dock over the years, usually traveling with Keth freight crews, keeping close to the adults, watching everything with those silver eyes that missed nothing. I knew a little of how they communicated. Tonal hum as emotional register, physical stillness as assessment, eye contact as the threshold between stranger and known. She was assessing me. I let her. My name is Riva, I said. This is my doc. Those men outside are not my friends. She blinked. In Keth I knew, a slow blink was acknowledgement, the equivalent of a nod. My husband had taught me that. He'd traded with Keth freight crews for years before he died, and he'd been the kind of man who learned things on purpose, who believed that knowing how someone said yes in their own language was the most basic courtesy a person could offer. I'd married the right man. I thought about that a lot, chained to the wall, I said. There's a water pouch in my left coat pocket. I can't reach it. You're welcome to it if you need it. She looked at my pocket for a long moment. Then, without haste, she rose from the floor and crossed to me and reached into my coat pocket and took the pouch out and drank from it. She stood close enough that I could see the pale silver of her eyes in detail, the slight luminescence of them in the dark, not a glow, not anything special or chosen, just the biology of a creature built for low-light tidal zones, where the sky above Arvel's reach was 2 moons and a gas giant most of the night. Her people saw in ranges I couldn't. She stood close enough that I could feel the cold coming off her soaked wrappings, like a fog. When she finished, she looked at the bracket above my head. She said one word in Keth. I didn't know it. I don't speak your language, I said. I know about 12 words. She looked at me, blinked. Then she reached up and touched the bracket, just touched it lightly, 2 fingers, and I felt the vibration travel down the chain to my wrists. She pressed harder. The bracket shifted a fraction of a centimeter. It was corroded. Of course it was corroded. Everything on the sea cliff face of the dock was corroded. The salt air came off the tidal surge, twice daily, and got into every joint and seam and fitting. Tomas had always been after me to replace the fittings on that side of the shed, and I had always said, next season, because the dock was paying less and less than the fittings were holding, and next season was always the season when things would be easier. The child pressed the bracket again, that tiny shift, that tiny catastrophic shift. I understood what she was telling me. Not yet, I said. Not until we know where they are. She went still. That was something else Keth children did. Not a freeze, not a flinch, just an absolute, considered stillness that a human child was incapable of. It was the stillness of something that had been trained, or born, or both, to read an environment rather than react to it. She turned her head toward the shed wall and listened. I listened too. I could hear the siren of patrol outside, the clank of their equipment, the low murmur of the sergeant's voice somewhere toward the main dock gate. 3 of them, possibly 4, maybe a 5th stationed at the skiff they'd come in on. They'd arrived the night before, 2 days after the Keth dropship had gone into the cliff-face tidal zone in the storm. I hadn't known the dropship was coming. Nobody tells the repair dock keeper what's flying through contested space on a given night. You just find out when the sea brings you the wreckage. I'd found the first debris pieces at morning tide. Keth hull plating, distinctive amber alloy panels with the corrosion-resistant coating the Keth used in wet environments. I'd gone to the lower shelf to see what had come in and found 2 things. A Keth emergency locator beacon, still pinging, and a length of anchor chain with a small amber gold hand tangled in the last links. I dealt with the beacon first, pulled it, turned it off, did in the brine tank where the signal would drown. Then I dealt with the hand, which led me to the arm, which led me to the child. She'd been barely conscious when I pulled her out. Hypothermia, exhaustion, a gash on her brow crest that had already closed in the way Keth wounds did. Quickly, the blood a dark amber that stained the chain links. I'd carried her up to the shed and wrapped her in the dock blanket and put her in the corner, behind the drive assembly, where no one would look, without reason. Then I'd made the mistake of going back out onto the dock. And Sergeant Draven and his 4 Shirev soldiers had been coming in through the gate. They'd been tracking the beacon signal. They'd had it on their instruments before I killed it, and they'd triangulated the general position. They knew a Keth vessel had gone down somewhere in the cliff zone. They knew, because these things are always known in contested border sectors, that a Keth command courier had been aboard. The child was the courier's aide. They didn't know she was a child. They didn't know she was 50 meters away, behind a drive assembly in a repair shed. They only knew that someone here might have seen something, might have pulled something from the water, and Sergeant Draven was the kind of man who expressed his uncertainty through chains. He'd been polite about it, in the way that men with authority over you are sometimes polite. He'd told me I was being detained for questioning under Sharev Compact Occupation Provision 7, allowed the detention of civilian dock personnel in contested zones during active search operations. He'd said it would be short. He'd said it was standard. Then he'd put my wrists in the cable and fix the other end to Tomas's wall bracket and set the cable length so my feet just touched the floor and walked away. That had been 6 hours ago. Now there was a small Keth child on the floor of my shed, touching the bracket, and I was calculating. The tide surge would come again in roughly 3 hours. The lower access panel would flood. When it did, she couldn't go back down that way until the tide dropped again. It was another 4 hours after that. So she was here for 7 hours minimum. The Sharev patrol changed every 6 hours, which meant a new configuration at dawn. The new shift might include the scanner team that Draven had signaled for. If the scanner team arrived before we moved, we were finished. They would go through the shed systematically. They would find her. I looked at the bracket. I looked at the child. "What's your name?" I said. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said it, Veiltorin, 2 syllables with a soft stop between them. The way she said it, it was almost a question, not uncertain, but offered carefully, the way you might offer something valuable to someone you weren't sure deserved it. "Veiltorin," I said, making sure I had the stop right. She blinked. Slow, deliberate. "Yes." "All right," I said. "Can you tell me how many men are outside? Do you understand how many?" I held up my fingers. She watched my hand. Then she held up 5 fingers. 5 men. That matched what I'd heard. I nodded. "Do you know this dock?" I asked. "Have you been here before?" She shook her head. Then she rose and walked to the workbench, moving quietly, not tiptoeing, not performing silence, just naturally quiet in the way the Keth were. The padding weight distribution they had from growing up on tidal shelves, where noise carried strangely. She looked at the tools on the bench without touching them. She looked at the drive assembly in the corner. She looked at the tidal pressure horn mounted on the wall above the lower access panel. A maintenance tool, a steel cylinder, the size of my forearm that connected to the dock's internal pressure system, used to clear debris from the lower channels with a pulse of compressed air. She looked at it for a long time. I said, "Do you know what that is?" She touched it, pulled her hand back, touched it again. Her head tilted, the Keth gesture of focused consideration, the slight cant of the brow crests that meant she was working something through. Then she looked at me with those pale silver eyes and hummed one low note. I had learned, over 11 years of Keth traders using my dock, that a low tonal hum was affirmative but complex. Not a simple yes, more like I understand this and I have a thought about it. "All right," I said. She went back to the workbench and sorted through the tools. Not randomly, not the way a child playing would sort, but methodically, the way a trained aide would, checking function and weight and purpose in a single efficient pass. She found the dock maintenance log, paper one I kept for tidal records, and turned pages until she found a blank one, and then she found a marking pen and began to draw. It was a map. It was my dock. She'd been here for what? 6 hours in the shed behind the drive assembly and 20 minutes visible to me, and she was drawing my dock from memory, and it was accurate. The main platform, the repair shed, the supply lines, the lower channel entry points, cliff face fissures, the skiff berths. The patrol route she marked with small, careful dots. The scanner team's likely entry point, which she marked with a different symbol. She must have seen them on other docks, must have memorized what a Sharev scanner team looked like when it deployed. She was not a child in the way I usually meant the word. She was small. She was young. But she was a working intelligence, trained and capable, and she had been trained by people who took that work seriously. I watched her draw and I felt something settle in my chest. Not peace, not yet, but steadiness. Steadiness of knowing the person beside you is not going to panic. "The pressure horn," I said. "You were thinking about it. What were you thinking?" She tapped the map, the lower channel, the fissure points. Then, she tapped the pressure horn symbol she'd added to the shed wall of her map. Then she drew an arrow to the lower platform, to the area just below the main dock gate where the Sharev patrol habitually gathered. I worked it through. If you triggered the dock's tidal pressure system from inside the shed, if you fired the horn hard, On the secondary circuit that bypassed the deck override, you would send a compression pulse down through the lower channels, and that pulse would hit the bottom of the lower access shafts under the main platform. And, in the fissures below the patrol area, the surge effect would be significant. Not dangerous. The tidal pressure system was built for dock maintenance, not for harm, but dramatic, loud, wet. Definitively, urgently loud and wet in a way that would pull every man on that dock, way from the shed and toward the main platform, to see what had malfunctioned. And in the 2 to 3 minutes of that confusion, a woman with corroded iron above her head and nothing to lose could get her, hands free. How long does it take to reset? I asked. She held up fingers, counted in a way I couldn't follow, then showed me 3, maybe 5, depending on how high the back pressure was. 3 minutes. I needed 3 minutes. And the bracket, I said. If I work at it, how long? She touched her chin. The Keth gesture for calculating. Then she held up a single finger. 1 minute. If I worked the bracket back and forth on the corroded bolt thread, worked it the right direction, it would pull in 1 minute. So I needed 2 minutes, minimum, after she fired the horn. 1 to get the bracket free, 1 to get the cable off and work my ankles loose. Can you fire it from outside the shed? I asked. She shook her head. The external control was on the main platform, on the dock master's panel, which was where Sergeant Draven's people were stationed. The only secondary control was in the shed, which meant she had to be in the shed to fire it. Which meant she was in the shed when the SREV came back in, I said. If you fire it, you have to go out the lower panel before they come in. She looked at the lower panel, looked at the clock on the workbench, looked at me. She held up a single finger. 1 minute. She needed 1 minute to get out before the surge. After that, the lower channel would be cycling, and she'd go with the current into the cliff fissure. The SREV wouldn't follow her there. The fissures were narrow, tidal, treacherous for anyone not built for them. She was built for them. She was Keth. This was the plan. I could see the whole thing laid out in her map. I'd see that she had drawn it correctly. I could also see that there was a margin, and the margin was thin, and the margin depended on me being faster than I thought a 53-year-old woman with stiff shoulders and 6 hours of circulation restriction in her wrists was going to be. How long until dawn? I said. She held up fingers. Counted. 3 hours. And when does the scanner team arrive? She tapped the map. The tidal calendar she'd seen on my workbench, the one that showed the ferry routes and the transit windows. She pointed to the dawn transit window. Scanner team at dawn. 3 hours. If we moved before then, we had a chance. If we waited, we didn't. I said, all right. She hummed that low affirmative note. I need you to do something for me first, I said. Before we go, I need you to understand something. She looked at me. There's a protocol, I said. Arvel's Reach is a neutral civilian dock under the contested border treaty of the 11th Reach Compact. Civilian dock personnel and non-combatant shelterees on Arvel's Reach territory are protected under Article 19. The Sharev Compact signed that treaty. Sergeant Draven knows it. He may be choosing to ignore it, but he knows it. I can get free and get my feet under me before his people regroup. I can invoke Article 19 out loud, on the dock, front of witnesses. The treaty requires any Sharev Compact officer to acknowledge the invocation. It doesn't end the occupation. It doesn't make them leave. But it means they can't take you without triggering a full treaty breach. A full treaty breach costs the Sharev Compact more than one Keth courier's aid is worth. She was very still. So I'm not just trying to run, I said. I'm trying to stand still in the right place long enough to say the right words. Do you understand? She looked at me for a long moment. Then she blinked, slow, deliberate. Yes. Good, I said. Then let's talk about timing. We had 2 hours and 40 minutes until dawn, and we used them. Not in conversation, in preparation. She showed me, by working my fingers through the motions, the correct angle for working the bracket. Not simply pulling down, which was how I'd been pulling for 6 hours and which had accomplished nothing. At a slight diagonal, pressing against the upper face of the mount while lifting, which would work the corrosion grain and loosen the bolt thread in the direction it had rusted. 15 degrees. She showed me with a tool from the bench held against the bracket, adjusting my wrists until I had the angle, practiced the motion without loading it, found the feel. While I practiced, she continued the map. She was not satisfied with a single page of it. She turned to the next sheet and drew the cliff face approaches, the fissure mouths, tidal flow directions at dawn. She noted the position of the Shurev skiff at the far berth. She noted the path between the main platform and the shed in terms of sight lines, marking the two blind spots where the repair cradle and the fuel cell stack interrupted the view. She worked fast and without erasing, told me she was confident in what she was drawing. Every mark was where she intended it. She reorganized the workbench so that my coat, which Dravin had dropped over the bench when he searched me, was in reach of where I would be when I got the cable off. My boots were under the bench. My dock key was in my coat's inside pocket. Perk. The dock key opened the circuit breaker cabinet on the main platform, and up the circuit breaker cabinet controlled the patrol alert horns. And if the patrol alert horns went off, every Shurev soldier on the dock was required by their own operational protocol to assemble at the gate. It was a secondary option if the pressure horn didn't buy me enough time. She had thought of that. She had found my coat, found the outline of the key through the fabric, and positioned it before I thought of it myself. In the hour before the pre-dawn tide drop, we sat in the shed in a quiet that I found, unexpectedly, bearable. Not comfortable. My shoulders were burning and my wrists had stopped feeling, like my wrists around hour 5. But bearable, in the way that quiet is bearable when you are not alone in it. She sat on the floor near the lower panel, wrapped in the dock blanket, watching the shadow line on the shed wall that moved as the gas giant rose on the eastern arc. She was marking time. I was marking time. We were doing it together without needing to say so. At one point she hummed, not the low affirmative. Something else, something I didn't know. It was short. 3 notes, descending. Does that mean? I asked. She looked at me, then she pressed her hand flat against the floor. The gesture, I thought, meant something like here or this place or steady. Yes, I said. That too. She looked at me a moment longer with those silver eyes. And then she went back to watching the shadow line. I thought about Tomas. Not with the usual grief. More with the particular awareness that comes when you are in a situation your dead husband would have handled differently. He would have had more keth than my 12 words. He would have known the tonal hum registers better. Would have known what the 3 descending notes meant. Would have been able to tell her something useful in her own language rather than the reverse. He was better at this than I was. He had always been better at this than I was. And for a long time after he died, I had thought that the dock would fail because of that difference. Because I was the one who could fix a drive assembly, and he was the one who could sit with a Keth child in the dark and know what the 3 notes meant. But the dock hadn't failed. And here I was, and here she was. And the bracket was on the wall, and the bolt was corroded to exactly the right angle. Some things work out without you understanding why until afterward. I said, "You've done this before." She didn't answer. The cant of the brow crests, that considering tilt, was very slight, and something in her eyes, the quality of the stillness, told me that this was not the first time she'd been in a shed, or a hold, or a narrow dark place, counting exits and assessing margins. Whatever her age, she had been doing this work long enough to know how it was done. I thought about the people who had trained her to do this work, and what those people would do if they found out the Shurev Compact had attempted to take her. Thought about that, and I felt something in my chest that I recognized after a moment as satisfaction. It was not my wrath. I had no army. I had a wall bracket and a tidal horn and a 3-minute window. But somewhere this in the contested black above Arvel's reach, there were people who did have armies, and they were looking for this child. And what I felt was the deep and particular satisfaction of knowing that I was on the right side of what was coming. At 20 minutes to dawn, she looked at me once to confirm. I looked at the bracket. I nodded. She crossed to the pressure horn. The Keth, when they focus, become a quality that I don't have a word for in any language I speak well. Not calm. Calm implies an absence of something. This was a presence. She became entirely and precisely herself. Every part of her attention organized toward the thing she was about to do. Nothing wasted. Nothing bleeding off in anxiety or second thought. She was small and cold and exhausted, and she stood at that wall fitting with the absolute stillness of something that knew exactly what it was going to do. She looked at me. I nodded. She fired the horn. The sound was not a sound I can describe in terms that don't undersell it. The dock maintenance horn on the secondary circuit is an industrial pressure instrument. It is meant to shift debris out of narrow channels. It is enormously physically loud. It shook the shed walls. It shook the tools on the bench. It sent a pulse through the dock floor that I felt in my ankles and my knees and my chained wrists. And then, half a second later, the compression wave hit the lower fissures under the main platform, and from out on the dock I heard the surge effect. The groan of the structural members. The wet percussion of pressurized water finding its way through stone channels, and then the shouting. Shirev's soldiers shouting, the clatter of equipment. Running. She was already at the lower access panel. She turned back to me once, just once, and the look she gave me was not a child's look of fear or farewell. It was the look of a working partner, making sure the work was going to get done. Her pale silver eyes found mine in the dim shed, and she blinked, slow and deliberate. Then she was through the panel and gone. I worked the bracket, 15 degrees, the diagonal, not the pull, pressed her face and lifted, and felt nothing for the first 8 seconds, and then felt the grain in the rust give. A tiny catastrophic give, the loosening of a thread that had not been turned in 14 years. I pressed and lifted and kept my breathing, even because there was no time for panic, and panic would cost me 10 seconds I did not have. 20 seconds in, the bracket moved. Not fell, moved. A centimeter of travel on the bolt. I pressed and lifted again. Another centimeter, one more pass, the bracket pulled free. The cable was still locked on my wrists, but the free end dropped, and I had the slack, and I used the workbench to brace and worked the cable end. Through the wrist lock. Draven had used a Shirev detention cable, and I had looked at the locking mechanism for 6 hours, and I knew exactly how it opened from the outside, and I worked it open in 45 seconds, and my wrists were free. The ankle hobble was rope. I used the marking pen from the workbench to lever the knot. Tomas had taught me that trick many years ago, standing in this same shed. I had the rope off in 20 seconds. I put on my coat. I found my boots. I was standing upright on my own dock floor, with 30 seconds to spare before I heard Draven outside calling the recall. His people had found nothing wrong with the platform, nothing exploded or flooding. Just a pressure surge from an old system that had clearly malfunctioned, and he was already suspicious, already pulling his men back toward the shed. I walked out of the shed and onto the dock. It was the last dark before dawn. The sky above Arvel's Reach was the deep gray blue of very early morning, and the sea cliff face caught the first thin light from the gassed giant on the eastern arc, and the water in the lower channels was still churned from the pressure pulse. It was cold. The salt air came off the cliff face the way it always did at this hour, clean and hard and smelling of deep water. Sergeant Draven was 40 meters away across the dock, walking toward me, and he stopped when he saw me standing there. His hand went to his sidearm. "Dock keeper," he said, "return to the shed." "No," I said. The word came out in a register I didn't entirely expect, flat and low and containing. Beat after a beat. 11 years of tide surge mornings, and my husband's good iron, and a child's pale silver eyes in the dark. Not anger. Older than anger. "You will return to the shed," Draven said, "or I will put you back on the wall." "You will not," I said, "because you will not touch a civilian dock keeper on Arvel's Reach territory without triggering Article 19 of the Contested Border Treaty of the 11th Reach Compact, which your compact signed and which governs this dock. I am invoking Article 19. I am invoking it now, on this dock, your soldiers as witnesses." He stopped walking. I had known he would. He was a precise man who followed form exactly. He knew the treaty. He had known it when he put the cable on my wrists, and he had done it anyway, because he had calculated that a woman alone on a border dock was unlikely to invoke a treaty in a way that created a formal record. He had been wrong. He had been wrong because he had done his calculation without accounting for the margin. The margin was 6 hours of looking at a corroded bracket and a Keth child who could draw a map from memory. "The sheltery provision," I said. Article 19, Section 4. Any non-combatant sheltery on Arvel's Reach territory under the care of a civilian dock keeper is a protected individual under this treaty. You will confirm this invocation, or you will be in treaty breach. Your compact will be in treaty breach. You know what that costs. He looked at me for a long moment. His soldiers were watching him. That mattered. They were witnesses. Whatever he did next, they would carry the memory of it, he said. There is no sheltery on this dock. There was, I said. She's gone. Which means your operation has failed, Sergeant. And you're standing in front of a formal Article 19 invocation that your soldiers just witnessed on a dock where you have no remaining justification for presence. If you leave now, the record shows an Article 19 invocation that terminated an occupation. If you don't leave now, the record shows something considerably more complicated. He looked at his men. He looked at the dock. He looked at me. He said, "We'll be back." Yes, I said. You probably will. They were gone inside 20 minutes. The kind of retreat that is performed with precision. Equipment inventoried, skiff loaded, no debris left behind. Because Sergeant Draven, whatever else he was, believed in the form. They left nothing except the faint marks of their equipment on the dock surface and the cable from my wrists that I found dropped by the shed door. I stood on the dock and watched the skiff round the cliff face and disappear, and then I went to the supply shed and made tea, because there was nothing else to do and my hands were shaking. The Keth rescue skiff came in at full dawn. I didn't hear them coming. The approach was a whisper. The Keth coastal vessels ran nearly silent in tidal zones, low-draft hulls designed for cliff shelf navigation, and they came around the southern fissure point, without the engine noise I would expected. I was on the dock, the second cup of tea in my hands, when I saw the prow come around the rock and I felt something in my chest, release that I hadn't known I was holding. There were 8 of them aboard. Adult Keth, in the travel gray that Keth crews wore in contested sectors, armed in the way that Keth military personnel are armed, entirely and without display, nothing visible, everything ready. They came alongside the dock without ceremony. The one who stepped off first was older than the rest, amber gold skin weathered to something nearly bronze, brow crests grown, and filed to the narrow points of an adult who had been doing this work for a very long time. She moved with the same quality the child had, that organized, unhurried presence that I had no adequate word for. She looked at me. She looked at the shed. She said something in Keth that I didn't catch, and then she said it again in trade, which the Keth spoke when they chose to. The little one. Lower channel, I said. She went through the cliff fissure on the south face during the tide window. She'll have come out in the shelter cove. There's a natural pocket below the third headland, out of the surge line. She knows tidal channels. She'll have waited there. The older woman looked at me for a moment, the same assessing stillness the child had, the same quality of measuring without rushing. Then she said, "You're the dockkeeper." "Riva Sorn," I said. "This is my dock. They chained you." It wasn't a question. I suppose the marks on my wrists were visible enough. "They did," I said. Something moved in the older woman's face. Not anger, not exactly. Something more contained than anger. The way a very deep current is contained by the fact that it doesn't need to rush. She said something in Keth to the crew and 2 of them went immediately back over the side, into a smaller tender lashed to the hull, pushed off toward the southern fissure. The older woman stayed on the dock. "We were 2 hours out when the dropship went down," she said. "Could not reach this position through the storm." "I know," I said. "There was nothing you could have done." She was in the water for 6 hours, I think, maybe more. She was cold and tired when I found her, but she was capable. She was very capable. The older woman looked at me for a moment. "She managed," I said. Something in the older woman's face settled. The deliberate Keth blink, slow, certain. We waited. It was not a long wait. The tender came back around the headland in 15 minutes, and Vale Torin was in it, in something warm and still streaked with salt, and sitting upright with the characteristic Keth stillness that, I realized, was simply who she was. Not trained composure, not bravado, just herself. She came over the dock ladder unaided. She crossed to me, stood in front of me for a moment and looked up at me with those pale silver eyes, and I looked at her. I thought about what to say. I thought about whether this was a moment for words at all. I thought about Tomas and his good iron and his 14 years of patient bolts rusting to exactly the right point of corrosion. I thought about the cold in the shed and the bracket and the angle of it, and the way she had stood at the pressure horn with everything organized and precise and present. I thought about the map she had drawn. I said, "Next time, Take the path past the second headland. The currents are better. She blinked. Then she pressed her forehead to my palm. I knew what it meant. My husband had told me years ago in this same dock, after a Keth freight captain had done it to him, on a disagreement resolved well, the farewell of the trusted. Not thanks. The Keth did not have a word that mapped precisely onto thanks, because in their language gratitude and debt were not separate concepts, and neither could be discharged with a word. This was something else. This was you are known. This is, I see you as someone who can be trusted with something I value. This is permanent and it does not diminish. I felt it in my palm for a long time after her skin left it. They left as quietly as they'd come. Psst. The skiff rounded the southern fissure and was gone into the cliff shadow. And then there was just the dock and the morning light, coming in off the sea, and the tidal horns, somewhere far below, beginning their early sequence. I went back into the shed. The bracket was on the floor where I'd left it, the chain cable still etched to the far end, corroded bolt thread visible in the end of the mount. I picked it up. I put it on the workbench. I stood there a moment with my hand on it, not thinking anything in particular, just feeling the weight of the iron, and the roughness of the corrosion, and the fact that it existed, and I was holding it. Then I went to find a new bolt. I had a dock to run. The bracket went back into the wall that afternoon. New bolt, new thread, properly treated against the salt air. I did it myself, the way Tomas had done it. I set it 6 centimeters higher than the old one. It was perhaps a small vanity, but I was 53 years old, and the dock was mine, and I was allowed small vanities. The Scifi Compact filed a formal objection to the Article 19 invocation. It took them 4 days to get the paperwork to the Reach Compact office, which was slow even by Scifi standards. And Compact office confirmed the invocation with the relevant notation and forwarded the file to the Border Arbitration Service. I gave my statement to the arbitration courier 2 weeks later, in this same shed, standing at my workbench, and I described every event from the moment Sergeant Draven put the cable on my wrists to the moment he left the dock. I described the bracket and the bolt, and the pressure horn and the angle. I did not describe the map. Some things don't need to be in the record. The arbitration found in favor of the Article 19 invocation, which nobody had doubted it would, and the Scifi Compact's occupation permit for Arvel's Reach was suspended for 90 days while the review panel assessed the detention. I don't know what happened to Sergeant Draven after that. I know he was precise, and he followed form, and I know that organizations that follow form have ways of dealing with officers whose form following has created embarrassing formal records. The arbitration found in favor of the Article 19 invocation, which nobody had doubted it would, and the Scifi Compact's occupation permit for Arvel's Reach was suspended for 90 days while the review panel assessed the detention. I don't know what happened to Sergeant Draven after that. I know he was precise, and he followed form, and I know that organizations that follow form have ways of dealing with officers whose form following has created embarrassing formal records. It wasn't my concern. The dock got busy again, the way docks do when an occupation lifts. Keth freight lines came back first. They always came back first because Keth freight crews believed in paying their accounts current, and they had accounts with me going back to before Tomas died. And the first captain through the gate after the Scifi permit lapsed was an old Keth man named Bosarath, who had been using my cradle winches since my husband's time. He didn't say anything about the Article 19 invocation. He didn't say anything about what had happened on the dock. He just handed me the fuel cell order the same way he always did, and when he left he paid 2 months ahead, which was not what he usually did, and which was a Keth thing that I understood to mean something. The independent traders came back next, then the survey crews, then eventually the Scifi Compact cargo haulers, because even occupied border moons have commerce that needs doing, and they had nowhere else to go. The dock ran. The tide surge came at 4:30 every morning, and I slept through it the way I always had. My concern was the dock, and the dock needed its drive assembly pulled and inspected, and the supply lines needed clearing before the next storm season, and the lower access panel needed the paint stripped and rehung with a proper seal, because a 14-centimeter gap in the hull was not something I should have left for 3 winters. I worked on the panel on a clear morning in early spring. Sun off the sea cliff face, tidal channels running quiet in the low-tide window, gulls working the outer shelf below. I pulled the old paint, got the panel off its hinges, cleaned the frame, measured for the new seal. The work was slow and exact, the way good dock work always is. And I was comfortable in the way I was comfortable with work. The kind of comfort that comes from knowing what you're doing. And why, from having hands that know their task, without needing to be told. I was fitting the new seal when I found the mark. Just inside the panel frame, where the paint had been thick and undisturbed for years, scratched into the metal with something narrow and precise. 4 small symbols in a line. Keth script. I couldn't read Keth script. I wasn't supposed to be able to. It was a logographic system that took years to learn, and I had 11 words of spoken Keth, and not a single written character. I looked at the marks for a while. Then I took a picture of them with the dock's survey tablet and sent it to the Keth freight agent I used for cargo, a woman named Sel, who had come through the dock a dozen times over the years, and who had been patient with my 12 words and had quietly appreciated that I knew them. Sel responded in an hour, she said, the marks are a waypoint notation, Keth navigation. Translated approximately, shelter found here, passage to safety, keeper can be trusted. I read it twice. I looked at the wall bracket, across the shed. I looked at the panel in my hands. I put the seal on carefully, making sure the fit was clean. When I was done, I hung the panel back on its hinges, and I left the marks where they were, inside the frame where no one would see them, unless they pulled the panel again. They were navigation. They were true. The dock was still my dock. The bracket was still on the wall, new bolt, properly set. The marks were inside the panel where the tidal light didn't reach. The horns went off at 4:30 the next morning, the way they always did. 3 long, 1 short. The surge came up through the cliff fissures and hammered the lower dock until the struts shuddered and the tie lines sang. Some sounds you stop sleeping through.